Hey everyone, welcome to the PlexTrac mini-series. This episode will feature a discussion around the blue team and features myself and Dan and Sean from PlexTrac. You can find out more at securityweekly.com/PlexTrac series. Welcome to the PlexTrac podcast series, getting the real work done in cybersecurity. In this episode, we're talking about the blue team, which, literally is where the real work is done and some of the most difficult work, I believe, not to take anything away from red teamers or purple teaming exercises, but the blue team has certainly its challenges cut out for them. Here with me today is Dan DeClaus, founder and CEO of PlexTrac.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.
As well as Sean Scott, the VP of Success at PlexTrac. Welcome, Sean.
Thanks, Paul. Always happy to be here.
And we're talking about the blue team, defending the crown jewels among everything else. We certainly have our work cut out for us. I think, have all of us been on a blue team before? Have we been on both sides, red and blue, or?
Yep. Lived the pain.
Yeah, certainly. Sean as well?
Yeah, I was more on the management side in the leadership positions. Not as technical as I would have liked to have been, but definitely.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting dynamics on the blue team because, of course, it's not about those technical controls. It's about communicating with your team and management that I've often found in the 15 years doing podcasts and being in this industry over 20 years. It's one of the more difficult things is from a blue team perspective, trying to convince your fellow teammates and management and executives and the board that there should be a focus on cybersecurity. And anything that can help us with that process, I think, is appreciated. Dan, I don't know if you want to set up a different way or tee off that for a moment.
No, absolutely. I think that it's the long lost art of communication, right? Mm-hmm. Is that being an effective cybersecurity professional on the blue team really requires navigating how you communicate risk and being able to effectively do that to the right stakeholders is one of those things that isn't necessarily taught, when you're looking at, a course on how to identify IOCs within packet captures and things like that, right? It's like there's hardcore technical skills that are very, very important. And then, once you get past that, how do you actually communicate that to where it's going to impact the business and really make the case for here's why you need to invest in your security posture and improving your program as a whole?
I think that getting people's attention is a lot easier than it used to be. There's been enough scary things that have happened to big names and important people in the news that it's no longer a fight, I think, to get your foot in the door as a information security leader in an organization that is trying to advocate for resources. But the challenge does come back to how do I communicate very technical risks in a way that is going to convey business impact. And almost to the point of getting away from even talking about the risk and just talking about the impacts. So I think we've come a long way. Obviously, we're still a very, very young domain as information security in general. But I think the days are over when people look at this kind of with their head cocked and funny. It's now just taking it to that next level and convincing them not only to fund the tooling and the people needed for your program, but how to incorporate the components of information security risk in every aspect of the business organization, in acquisitions, in planning, in strategic decisions about partnerships that you're going to make.
It's interesting. In the notes, it mentions reducing the impact of inevitable breaches, and boy, does that speak volumes. Because I think many of us as human beings, we like to think that we can eliminate 100% of the risks, and I think a lot of the things we do in our daily lives, we almost believe the lie that we can reduce 100% down to 100% of the risk, that we can lock our doors, lock our cars, that we can do things with our health, and we're doing all these things, and we're like, yeah, we can get rid of all the risk. But boy, in cybersecurity, if that is ever a case where we can reduce it, but we can't eliminate it 100%, that's true in other areas. But I think there's this perception almost where they're like, well, we can just get rid of the cybersecurity risks altogether and not worry about it anymore. And that's not the case, right?
Yeah,
it's
we're all
dynamic
in
of
the
an attack
business of
surface.
risk management at this point, right? I mean, and always have been. And so it's really, where does this impact the business? How do we reduce the risk or eliminate certain risks? But as a whole, yeah, a breach is inevitable. It's some form of a breach, right? And so really the blue team's job, which is a tall order and a big task, is to try and identify where's the most likely place to get breached, and how do we make sure that whatever our crown jewels are, with what is the biggest impact to the business, how do we make sure that is the most secure it can be, and that we can detect any activity that's anomalous or malicious towards that set of crown jewels, so that the big thing is avoided, and we can mitigate around the smaller incidents and events, right?
John?
Yeah, I think that it is a fool's errand to try to achieve, no risk and no breach. But absolutely, and it's just because of how rapidly, the attack surface is updating and changing. PlexTrac, we're releasing code daily. We're releasing very secure code. But in any organization, you're dependent upon a lot of different solutions. If we've learned anything from the SolarWinds attack, is there's multiple ways, into your environment, some of which you may not have thought about in the past. So absolutely, we have to figure out how do we, and that really is the where an effective blue team has to start. It has to start in the planning phase. It has to start with those objectives. What are we trying to achieve with this program, and and how do we measure that? And so the measurement is one of those things that's also, I think, developed and come a long way over the past 2 decades in our industry. Is that we have started to take a look at metrics such as mean time to remediation. And that's one that's actually fairly easy for even organizations that aren't very mature to be able to begin to measure, report upon, hold themselves accountable against benchmarks. And then potentially at some point graduating to some of those metrics that are harder to produce, such as, what's our mean time to detection? It's unrealistic, I think, for most organizations to be able to measure that if they don't have a good forensic capability, but still an important metric. And I don't know if there's other metrics, Paul or Dan, that you've seen, and what's the linkage between those objectives and the metrics?
What I think is interesting, though, when I compare this to the global pandemic, and I won't spend too much time on it, but I think in cybersecurity, we've got a lot of really good data that we've collected over time, that our systems collect over time, that we can come up with some really good metrics, mean time to detection, to your example, Sean. And I think when we look at the global pandemic, we try and reduce the risk. So we do things like socially distance, and we wear masks, and we try to roll out vaccines, right? And all of this is not to wipe out the global pandemic and the virus in one fell swoop. It's to reduce the impact, right? And what we do to reduce the impact is based on data. I think that's what got us in a really bad place with the global pandemic, is we just didn't have a lot of that data because this was a new virus and we had not experienced a global pandemic in about 100 years. So we didn't have good data to work off of. I think the kind of encouraging thing for me when I hear you both talk and look at the notes is that we've got some really good data in cybersecurity. It's a matter of what we do with it to develop these metrics.
Yeah, I think we've all been in the space for well over 15 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not to make us feel old or anything, but we've seen it mature a long ways.
Yeah.
And in the early days, it was all around that hard shell defense, right? And then they start talking more about the defense in depth, and then how do you measure what your defenses are doing once they're inside? And so we've gotten a lot more data around here's what the attackers are actually doing, right? And we are able to now speak more intelligently around the attack life cycle. And so we have a lot of data around indicators of compromise and the different TTPs that are being executed along the way. And so being able to centralize those and aggregate them and say, like, okay, here's when this attack actually started. Here's when somebody in one of the teams, whether they were in the SOC or our MSSP, picked it up. That's when we first got the alert. So you have a lot more information around how quickly can we respond to this information and these attacks. And that's an important piece of the puzzle. And so that's more from the responsive capabilities. And then, where we've also seen a big shift is more on the proactive capabilities, right? Trying to preempt some of these activities. We know these are going to happen. how can we maybe eliminate some of those, the onset of some of these things? And that's in that more proactive assessment, continuous assessment mindset. And that's really where that mean time to remediation comes into play, where, you can say like, hey, this is when this issue got reported. Like, this is when this risk or this vulnerability got reported. How long did it take to actually address it in some capacity, whether we reduced the risk or we eliminated the vulnerability? That's important. Those are important metrics to be able to have at your fingertips to really show the progress that you're making as an organization.
Because we can simulate a lot of these things, which I think is interesting to, I love the peanut butter spread approach. And I think what helps us get to, disrupting the key phases of the attack is our ability to emulate an adversary. That could even be in a vulnerability scan. It could be an adversary emulation from a team of people. It could be breach and attack simulation. We can simulate these things very easily in our environment versus in the real world, as an example, and start to uncover those key things, and also then measure it, right, which is the important part. And, coming from a vulnerability scanning background, spent 7 years working for a vuln scanning vendor, and I was like, we can scan a lot of stuff, but it only gets better if we actually fix it. And then how do we know what to fix, and if it's been fixed, and how well we're doing at fixing it? Those are the bigger issues.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sean.
I would ask Paul, why are you scanning? What is the objective? What is the information that we're trying to collect here? And obviously scanning is but one small and very, very small component. The concept of, how do we prioritize where we put our defensive efforts? As I mentioned before, I come from a DoD background, and not all of it, in fact, most of it was in very kinetic operations, not necessarily in cyber. And when we plan our objectives for the defense, it's really about getting inside of how do we break the chain of events that leads to adversary success. And so when we plan and we war game and we come up with our own defensive responses, the intent isn't to necessarily counter every move by the adversary in all places. That's just going to result in the adversary having the advantage, because then they can rapidly shift their focus at the time and places they're choosing to meet their objectives. And so in the defense on a blue team, where do we want to make our stands? Where do we need to ensure that we get in front of the adversary, that we have the robust techniques, that we are techniques tested and defenses in place? If you try to cover down on all of the phases of the attack life cycle, you're never going to be good at any of them. If everybody's special, nobody's special. So you mentioned focusing on the key areas, Paul, and maybe Dan, I'd be interested in, you led a blue team at one point. Where did you try to focus your efforts? What phases of the attack life cycle?
Yeah, I think it largely comes down to the context of the organization and what the capabilities are with the talent that you have on the team, as well as what tools you have at your disposal. And I think that what's the most important thing you have to ask as a blue team leader is what problem are we trying to solve first, right? There's a lot of things, and you're going to get a lot of noise from a lot of vendors about how their product or their platform is the one that you need that's going to help solve a lot of your problems, right? And that's the wrong approach, right? The right approach is to say, what are we trying to solve? What can we do today in more of a manual effort where we have a pad and paper and we can solve some problems today. And as you start to get into those rhythms, and I think what's important is that it's a process. It's not something that you can just hit a button and you're done. You have to continue to hone it. You have to continue to mature. And as you go through those small processes, you start to identify what solutions you need to go get. So where we focused was, well, we had a firewall. Let's at least identify how effective is it being. What are the things? Let's review the configuration and see what are the things that we're allowing in and out. And what makes sense here. And starting to identify the different tactics and techniques that an attacker will have within our environment is really where we started. And you see good strides when you approach it that way. Paul, I'd be curious to know kind of what your experience had been.
Yeah, I think based on what I've learned since I guess I still am blue team today, helping out with the the Cyber Risk Alliance in our own security posture, is the missing link for me that I've come back to more recently, late last year and in this year, is really adopting that attacker mindset for your defenses. Sean, similar to what we were talking about, I think blue teams kind of get stuck in the, we've got to protect this and we've got to implement these things, and this is going to help us defend against the attacker. And attackers come in and they look at that and they're like, well, I can just walk right around that firewall, right? And I think adopting that the attacker mindset, thinking about how the attacker would approach the problem. The story that I absolutely love. I don't know if you guys know Mike Poore. He's a SANS instructor. Actually took classes with Mike, and Mike's a great storyteller, and I don't do it justice. But Mike was doing a consulting engagement. He was looking at their security architecture that was printed out on a piece of paper, and Mike's the showman, and he strokes his beard and looks at the paper, and they were pretty confident in some of their designs. And he looked at it for a minute or two, and he got his pen and drew a circle around. He's like, "What's that?" And then, just kind of like everyone turned white and kind of panicked because they started thinking about the repercussions of, well, yeah, that's probably not a great thing, right? Mike can look at that and go in a couple of minutes and go, yeah, that's the one of the issues right there, and probably your biggest one. And what I like about the PlexTrac platform and being able to pull in this data from folks like Mike that may have findings from your vulnerability assessments, from your penetration tests, is you can put that picture together of what the attacker mindset might look like and have that all in one place. Because until we have that one place, we've got a lot of disparate thoughts and reports and emails and things floating around, but you need that central repository to look at all of the threats and how they've kind of shaken out, and adapt that attacker mindset to go, okay, now here's the priority, right? It's not just a priority at a CVSS score from a vuln scan. It's a lot more than that, as you guys know.
Yeah, I mean, and as blue teams continue to grow, you're going to have more and more, divisions or departments that are focused on specific things like application security, GRC, incident response, threat intelligence, threat hunting, a lot of different activities that are going on a daily basis. And at the end of the day, all of that comes back down to how are we communicating risk effectively within the environment. And so being able to centralize those activities and having a central collaboration point for everything related to the risk and the proactive aspects of our engagements are really important. And so PlexTrac really can serve the need there in terms of being able to normalize data as well, right? A finding from a penetration test might be more severe or treated differently than a finding out of a vulnerability scan, but having a single way to view and manage those is really what's important for the blue team, so they're not shifting context too far out of where they need to be focused. And that's one major goal of PlexTrac, is to keep everybody focused on getting the real work done, staying away from the things that waste time, because time is valuable in all aspects of the blue team, and also helping improve the talent shortage, right? From a perspective of, you don't have to hire more people because we've eliminated a lot of the wasted time throughout their day, so they can stay focused and get more work done. And those are all important aspects to a blue team, because there's so much to keep track of, right? There's so much to be mindful of. The adage, is still true that an attacker really only has to find a few holes in your environment, whereas the blue team, they really are responsible for plugging all the holes, and like we said, that's not possible. So how do you at least identify what the most important holes are to work on?
And when we unpack risk into, likelihood times impact, I think that's really, it's interesting. And no matter how many years we talk about that, we can still unpack it in so many different ways. And one of the things that I like in an aspect, we talked about metrics. It's not just about what vulnerabilities you have or even about what software you have. There are now ways we can get into, well, how many instances of that software do we have, and who's using it, and what are the vulnerability findings, and then what did the pen test team do with it, right? All those kind of speak to helping us prioritize, because as we all know, and you spend time as a defender, the risk is very subjective. Vulnerability findings are very subjective. How do we take that subjectiveness away from it, right? And that's one of the things I like about pulling all these different assessments and findings together, regardless of what it is, can start to chip away at that subjective, like, I feel like we should patch this today. That's not where you want to be, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Sean, I don't know what your experience has been, in the past, but being able to centralize and identify, a single way for prioritizing risk, is one of the major goals of PlexTrac, right? And knowing that you have people that you're paying a lot of money, whether they're a consulting firm or an outside assessment team, or your internal team, that you want them to be able to identify those risks in a timely fashion, be able to report them effectively, and then allow your stakeholders to make quick decisions on what the priorities truly are within the context of the organization.
Mhm.
Well, Dan, not to get too philosophical and abstract, but risk itself, the concept of risk. We talk about a vulnerability, an unpatched system being a risk, but the people who are making decisions about resources, for the most part today, are getting very abstracted information. And the reason why they're getting very abstracted information is because if I'm managing an information security program, and I'm balancing 15 different spreadsheets from 15 different products that have told me bits and pieces of places where I have true technical risk in the environment, the only way to in the past, for somebody who is entrusted with aggregating all this information and telling a story to leadership and people who are making resource decisions, was to generalize and to abstract. And anytime you do that, you're definitely introducing the subjectivity that you talked about, Paul, into that. Everyone's going to have, if someone's a storyteller, they're going to tell the story they want to tell, regardless of what the facts are, right?
Right.
And where a platform like PlexTrac really kind of flips that on their head is, I don't want people making decisions about resource allocations based upon stories and abstractions. I want a way that the truth data, what's really wrong in my environment, give me the hard data, and then having ways that I can aggregate those data so I still can tell the story. I've got the numbers, but underpinning that is the truth data, and not somebody's version of it. And that's really one of the things that I find most valuable if you're really using PlexTrac as one of those foundational management tools in your information security program.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of that subjectivity and, the person who's the best storyteller in the room can get the most resources is interesting. I like that, Sean. I think we don't often think about it that way. And I think that's one reason why we may fall back on something like compliance, right? To have a list, to check the box. It makes us feel good in a certain way. I mean, it breeds a little bit of fear, like, oh my God, if we're not compliant, like there could be repercussions. But if there's controls that aren't in place that should be, that aren't in the compliance checklist, we don't have that same feeling, which is kind of interesting. And I think one reason why people fall back on compliance and go, well, if we're compliant, we're secure. And as we know, that's not true. But there's also a compliance is also important on the flip side of that. And you also allow folks to track your compliance activities, which is certainly an aspect in your security program. How does that work?
Yeah. So what's great about PlexTrac is like we said, we're kind of eliminating those spreadsheets of how they conduct assessments.
Mm-hmm.
So we have an assessments module that really allows the GRC teams or the teams that are focused more on questionnaire-based assessments, whether those are going out to third parties or whatnot, to centralize all of those assessments into the PlexTrac platform and conduct those questionnaires, and then be able to submit those questionnaires immediately into a report, right? So like, here's the risks that we identified straight out of that. So it streamlines that entire report writing process after the assessment is done, as well as collaboration during the assessment, right? So I think one of the key aspects there is that we're really helping streamline that process as well as enhance the process. And so from there, you can now tag information with different types of controls and things that should be in place. And you can marry that with the other types of activities going on in the environment, specifically around, the more proactive, technical assessments like a penetration test or a purple team engagement. And we built this out of necessity, right? We're getting questions around this all the time. And so, we're really trying to keep our focus on, where are we helping the security professionals get their job done, and providing, the empowerment and equipment, to help them be successful. And I think as leaders in an organization, in any kind of organization, that's your number one job, is to empower and equip your team to be successful. And whether that's training, whether that's tools, whether that's time, being able to, help your team, who are your champions for progress, to really make sure that you're keeping them focused on the right things. And so that's one of the missions of PlexTrac. But I think in general, from a blue team perspective, that's really the goal, is ways to track your maturity and your growth over time. Compliance, has gotten a bad rap, over the time period that we've been in the space, predominantly because it has become like a checklist mentality. Like, once I get that box checked that I'm compliant, I'm good to go. We can focus on other things. And that aspect has failed the industry, in that, it's a continual process, right? There's a continual growth aspect to improving your risk posture. And so what I love about where the industry is heading is, continuing to keep the focus on the attack life cycle. What are the attackers actually doing within the environment? What is an adversary, his mission once they get in, or how do they get in? And so when we can continue to normalize language around that, compliance also plays an important part of that. But, you can start to track and measure how you're growing with respect to what the adversaries could be doing in your environment. And I am excited about where the industry is headed in that regard.
Dan, I spent a lot of time, as working with most of the frameworks that were popular in the world and in industries. And one of the requirements of any framework is, have you provided your blue team with the tools they need to do their job? Do you have X solution in place against this risk? And that's a great first step. Have we bought the thing that my blue team needs in order to defend the kingdom? If they don't have the shields and they don't have the armor, they're not going to be very effective. However, you hit the nail on the head about how important the investment in the personnel is in the training. Myself, I'm sure Paul, I know you, Dan, we've all been in environments where they've got some eye-watering solutions, things that I wish that I had access to, and they're failing to really bring the value out of those things. And I think that, if you're a blue team leader and you're making resource decisions, one of the hardest things for you to do is to find that effective balance between people and technology. Because if I've got all the technology in the world and I don't have the people trained to use it, I'm not getting any value. At the same time, an army of peasants is not going to be able to, to charge one phalanx unit. So, how have you, Dan and Paul, made those decisions, and how do you ensure that you're finding that right balance of where you invest your resources to make your blue team effective?
Yeah, I think for me, it's, automation is kind of it's a scary word for a lot of people. And I've actually tuned it somewhat to be workflow improvements, right? And to really help the blue team to just be more efficient at what they do in this example. And what's encouraging to me is, Dan, I think you mentioned it at some point, that bringing kind of that DevOps more mentality into the blue team. And I think it's encouraging. And we have the processes and technology in order to do that. We may have to bring some of our people up to speed on those. But my approach today would be to leverage the great technology that's out there, automating your vulnerability scan, doing breach and attack simulation, and automating the remediation, putting that in one platform such as PlexTrac, where the blue team can just get that constant feedback, that's that prioritized list, so that they're not getting that traditional 5,000 page vulnerability scan report, and then they have to go through everything and hear feedback and subjectivity from everyone. If you're giving them a clear mission and you're streamlining and automating their workflows, there's still people involved that have to do the work. It has to be tested and all those things. But I think we have the right pieces we can put together to have that really great workflow for the blue team, so that they've got a really great list to work off of, right? I think that's what's missing for all these years. It's just giving the blue team a really great list to work off, and having that be in one place is super important.
Yeah, the automation aspects are so important and talked about a lot in a lot of different capacities within the blue team, and even within the different specialties within the blue team as well, like SOC, versus vulnerability management versus DevSecOps, and you're exactly right. The blue team activities are continuing to shape their mindset in a more continuous life cycle. And you draw that analogy with the software development life cycle where code is getting deployed all the time, right? Changes are happening all the time. When I started in the Department of Defense, you were getting a DITSCAP certification every 3 years, right?
Right.
And then DIACAP comes along and it's every 1 year, right? And then they continue to hone it into like, no, this is a continuous compliance type of thing, right? It's not we get this done every year. And so staying focused on what are the things that we need to automate now and continuously assess to improve our maturity and our posture are where the industry is going. And that's what's most important, is that you take some of those menial tasks out of the picture at that point and keep the brain power focused on the things that really matter. So continuing to automate those processes, centralizing your activities into a single platform like PlexTrac really help the collaboration across those activities and teams as well, and provide a single place for communicating that risk and your progress over time. We've talked about it, from the red team perspective of like, there's doing a lot of activities. Now we can document those things. We can document the activities that are going on within the blue team to actually show like, here's the progress we're making. Here's where all these vulnerabilities are getting sourced. Here's the activity that's happening, and here's who's been responsible for this. And we're showing progress over time. And that's what an important piece of the puzzle that tends to get lost when we talk about like metrics and growth, right?
And there's a lot of different ways that we identify risk. We've talked about, how in the past, certain, the cool guys on the red team were always held in higher esteem, than potentially the folks doing the framework-based assessment, the GRC side of the space. But in reality, everybody can benefit from visibility that come from all those different ways that we're identifying risk, and the risks are related. And some of the problems that we've unfortunately experienced in the past is information gets stovepiped, and not with it. If you don't have the holistic view of your environment that you get from bringing all of these different ways to identify vulnerabilities and risks together, then everybody's trying to complete their little piece of the defense without understanding the strategic picture, and not understanding where weaknesses in one area may result in unexpected risk in the area that I'm responsible for. And so that's why I think a lot of our partners find so much value in PlexTrac, is that we bring all that together. We break down the silos, and I've got that one place to go. I can search and find exactly, all of the different things that impact a given asset or a given organization in one place without spending 2 hours digging through spreadsheets and find the data I need.
Yeah, it's that continuous assessment. And I think you're right, Sean. Sometimes blue teams will be really good in one aspect, really good at patch management. But as we know, a finding could be we need to turn off this service. A finding could be we need to change this configuration. A finding may be we need to sunset these accounts, right? And do better at role-based access. And in all those findings need to be in one place. And even if you have a blue team that's really good at patching, well, I mean, guess what? A lot of the attacks that we see, they didn't rely on a vulnerability that was in software somewhere. It was a misconfiguration. It was a access control that was incorrect. And we need to make sure that all of these things are findings, and to the DevOps style approach, are being communicated. The right information is being communicated to the right people so that they can take an action. And that's the only way we're going to be more resilient and able to reduce the impact of breaches. Because sure, they might get in, but if we're covering all these areas and really responding well to different types of controls that might be missing or other things in our systems, then we're in a much better place. And we haven't even talked about the detection aspect of it, right? This is really all in the reaction kind of phase.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And so keeping your focus on all the different aspects in a single spot is really important. And that's why, that's what our mission is at PlexTrac, is to empower that blue team to stay focused, to continuously assess, to continuously grow, and not have to worry about, hey, I've got this. They don't have to context switch, from different tools and different platforms for different functions, right? Is that everybody can stay consistent and collaborate effectively.
It's fantastic.
And we tend to talk about reporting of vulnerabilities and always talk about the offense and whether or not the offense was successful and why was the offense successful. One of the things I'm really most proud about that we've done in the last 6 months at PlexTrac is we've really empowered the blue team to tell the story of their successes, and not just their successes, their failures as well. Our runbooks module was built from the ground up that we're going to empower the blue team to collect data, report, identify their detection capabilities, and provide them with that same level of care and attention that we do when we're documenting the offensive successes, and bringing those together in one place so that we can correlate the offensive actions or the adversary actions if it's the real world, right? But providing them with a way to document, measure, really, and discuss and improve their detection, because prevention is ideal, but detection is a must, right?
But that's a great point, Sean, because the red team's failures are the blue team's successes. And I don't think ever before we had a platform where we could track that, right? Because you'd always get the pen test report and you'd be like, oh, look at all the stuff the blue team missed, right? That's only half the picture. The other half of the picture is all the things the blue team is doing well in the attacks they thwarted. So that's a great point.
Yeah, exactly. That's great.
Well, Dan and Sean, thank you so much. This was a fun episode.
Yeah, thanks,
Absolutely.
Paul. We really appreciate it, and always enjoy talking to you. And here's to empowering the blue teams, right?
Absolutely.
Blue team for the win in 2021.
Love it.